Episode 29. Hello, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Dogman Encounters Radio. I'm Vic Cundiff, and I'll be your host as we listen to eyewitness encounters involving one of the most terrifying cryptids, dogmen. Our guest tonight is John Blatt. John, welcome to Dogman Encounters Radio. Thanks so much for coming.
Oh, thanks, Vic. Thanks for having me on.
For starters, John, please give us a brief bio on yourself.
I was born in suburbs of Chicago, and until about the age of 8, moved to Ohio for most of my childhood until I left for the Air Force at the age of 20. And through a course of life and many other interesting things, I ended up in the Pacific Northwest. And I love it here. I've always wanted to live up in the Pacific Northwest, and mostly because of my interest in Sasquatch. I've been here for about 8 years now, and one of the things that I'm very passionate about is primitive skills. I love to spend a lot of time in the wilderness and practice what they call bushcrafting or primitive skills. Basically go into the woods with nothing. Of course, I go in with my clothes and everything else, but I like to try to live as naturally as I can when I'm in the forest. It's my sanctuary. I'm a fairly spiritual person, so I really love to go into the woods and feel at home there. That's where I'm at.
Let me ask you this, John. When you were small, your mother shared a very interesting story with you about a friend who told her about an incident or a series of incidents that he experienced involving a baby's cry. Could you share that story with us?
Sure. When I was around the age of 10 or 11, my mother used to do house cleaning for people, and one of the places that she got hired to do the cleaning for was this house out in the country, pretty far away from any town. She became friends with the owner of the house, and one day during the course of conversation, the owner told her an experience that was passed down in their family when the house was first built back in the mid-1800s. At the time, it was fully forested area. Now a lot of it is farmland out there, but when their great-great-grandfather, who first owned the house and had a family there, told a story and passed it down through generations of an experience that they had one night. The father was married and had some children. The father had gone into work in town and would get dropped off at the beginning of the driveway. The driveway would go down about a couple hundred yards. I've been out there before when I was a boy. So it would be a decent walk at night to walk a couple hundred yards through the forest to your house. And the story that was relayed to my mom, and she relayed that to me, was that he was dropped off at this road. It was the practice every night, I guess, when he was working. As he was walking down the dirt road to his home, he heard a baby cry in the forest. Kind of far away, but enough where he could make out that it was a baby cry. And he at first was very concerned because he had a baby of his own at the time. So he at first wanted to go into the woods, but it's like he didn't have any light source, and going into the woods in the middle of the night didn't make any sense to him. But he was still fairly concerned, but he kept walking, and the sound would happen, and then it would be silent for a while, and as he continued walking, he heard the sound again, and it sounded a little closer. And then he continued to walk, and as he continued down the driveway, the baby cry kept getting closer and closer to where he was. as he was walking in. He started to pick up the pace. You know, he didn't really know what to think about it. He was upset because the possibility it could be his own child in the forest in the middle of the night crying. And he didn't have any answers, of course, since he was experiencing this, not being with his family. And as he got near the end of the driveway or the road to his house, it curves to the right, and then it's a big farmhouse there. And as he made the turn around the bend there, the sound came right up to the edge of the forest. And he had this overwhelming sense that he needed to go into the forest to the sound of the baby crying. And he started walking towards the sound, and he stopped himself, and he just knew that it didn't make any possible sense that it could be his child. An infant child can't walk through the woods in the middle of the night, you know, and cover the distance that it did. So logically, he knew that it couldn't be his child. He got quite afraid at that point and started running to his house, and he ran up on the porch, went through the door, shut the door, and locked it. Almost immediately after he locked the door and was standing in disbelief of what had just happened to him, he heard footsteps come up onto the porch, and the doorknob moved, and like it was trying to open up the door to come in, whatever it was. And then he could hear the footsteps leaving the porch. And then shortly after that, from the back of the house where they had kept quite a bit of livestock, I knew that they had chickens and I believe some goats. I think even they had a cow or two. And they heard these horrible screams, cries and wails, and they didn't know what to think. And they could hear the animals being destroyed in the back of the house. Horrible sounds that came from out back. And the next morning, I don't know if they got much rest or not after that experience, but in the morning, after the sun came up, they went outside and all their livestock had been destroyed. A normal predator would go after one chicken or goat, then eat it. It didn't look like that was the case, that everything had been torn apart, almost like it was upset that it didn't get what it wanted. I'll always remember my mom relayed that story to me. If you knew my mom, she didn't like anything like that. She wasn't into any of these scary stories or scary movies or anything that had to do with the paranormal or anything like that. So she wasn't too fond necessarily of wanting to tell it, but she did tell it to my sister and I, and of course I never forgot it. And I don't think I ever will.
Oh, I don't think I'm ever going to forget that story either. If I'm ever out in the woods again, John, and I hear a baby crying, guess what I'm going to think about? And also, too, for the listeners, I know I'm going to get more emails on this, but yes, dogmen do jiggle doorknobs and try to manipulate them to try and get into structures. I hate to say that, like I said, I'm probably going to get a lot of emails on that, but it's true. That story about the baby cry sound, that does tie into something that John's going to share with us later on in the show, but that's down the road. Before we leave the topic of your childhood, John, I want to ask you about your beliefs when you were young. Were you into Bigfoot? Did you read up on them, or did you not really care much about them?
My early years, I guess I was like any normal kid. I wasn't really exposed to anything, at least in my family, I wasn't really exposed to anything strange or paranormal or anything along those kind of lines. But it wasn't until I had my own experience at the age of 7 that kind of impacted me for the rest of my life. And after that experience, that changed. I would do a lot of my own research and study and reading as much as I could on those subjects. So,
John, you mentioned the encounter that you had when you were 7, the encounter that basically set the table for you and the subsequent encounters that you were to have later on through the course of your life with other cryptids. Could you tell us about that encounter that started everything off?
sure, no problem. When I was 7 years old, I went on a field trip with my school to one of the nature preserves in the general area outside of Chicago, and I remember it being very woodsy. There was a lot of wildlife, and I remember there being like a swamp. It's a swampy area, and I remember a lot of that time of my life is kind of fuzzy. You know, back when you're 7 years old, at least at this point in my life, I don't really have a whole lot of details of recollections except of the story that we're about to embark on here. When I was 7 years old, we were walking down this trail in the woods, and I remember being in the back of the class on this trail. This is like really the first time I had ever experienced that. I remember looking to my right down at the ground and seeing a little turtle. Well, I got totally engrossed in this turtle that was on the ground to my right, and as any little boy would, I did not notice that the rest of my class had continued on down the trail without me, and I'm not quite sure how much time had passed by. I think at least enough to where it was probably a few minutes. I remember standing up and looking around and thinking, oh, I'm by myself. As soon as I stood up and looked down the trail, about 25 to 30 feet away was a giant hairy monster. I really remember being just in shock at what it was I was looking at. I didn't know what I was looking at because I had never experienced anything even in the ballpark of as a 7-year-old boy, anything like that. And I remember it. I could not see its face. The hair had come over its face. It wasn't as muscular as some other Sasquatch encounters are. You know, they tend to be some of them very large and muscular, but this didn't seem to be that way. It was fairly skinny, but to me it was a giant too. I was looking up at it, and I remember it gently swayed its arms as it was moving back and forth, and then it let out this wail, like a cry. Not like a baby cry, but like some of the Sasquatch sounds that you can hear on the internet. It was so loud. I remember feeling it in my chest. And the next thing I remember after that, that I was being carried by my teacher, and there were a couple other adults that were around me as we were walking down the trail. So the time the Sasquatch had let out this wail to the time that I was being carried down the trail by these adults, I have no recollection of. I don't know what happened. All I remember is that I was very upset. I was crying, something that I don't really necessarily enjoy talking about, but as a little boy, it was quite embarrassing that I had soiled myself. And I remember the teacher was upset with me that I had run off, and that then on top of it I had soiled myself on top of it. And I was just in a terrible state, you know, of embarrassment, of having that experience and of soiling myself. but also of having this encounter. And I remember trying to explain to the adults that I had just seen a hairy monster, and that went just, nobody paid attention to that at all. I was just making up a story to them. Other than those details, I don't really remember a whole lot. You know, I wish I could say that I know more specific details about that experience, but other than those things, I mean, I really would like to maybe at some point even do a hypnotic regression to know what happened during that time where I don't have any memory. But that is kind of what started me down this path of, almost forced me down this path in many ways, of becoming a Sasquatch researcher and being very open to anything and everything that has to do with the unexplained and the mysterious in this life.
One last thing I want to touch on, John, before we leave the childhood segment of discussion. You said that you had night terrors as a result of that encounter.
Yeah, I sure did. For most of my childhood, even into my teen years, I had night terrors. And it didn't happen every night, but I would have these recurring nightmares of what I called, especially when I was younger, I had called the siren monster. Because that's the kind of the noise that it made, like an ambulance siren would make. And I remember being very afraid at night sometimes while lying in bed, and especially when I would hear sirens. If you live in a city, you know, you would hear sirens every once in a while at night. Lying in bed and hearing the sirens, I was so afraid because I was sure that the siren monster was like coming for me. I remember being scared, imagining it coming up the stairs, you know, into my room at night. But I did have ongoing night terrors about hairy monsters. And I really didn't understand what that was all about. My parents didn't either. They didn't know what to think about it all. I didn't have anything like that before this experience. And it wasn't really until I was about, I think it might have been even the next year. I remember being 8, right before we moved to Ohio. We moved to Ohio when I was 8. I remember one of my parents had gotten a Reader's Digest book on unexplained mysteries. And I remember coming across the Bigfoot section in that book, and I was just stunned when there was remember someone had drawn a sketch of a Sasquatch, but it looked exactly like what I had seen in the forest. You know, when I had that encounter, and I realized that it was a Sasquatch or a Bigfoot, as was more the term back then. And, you know, ever since then, I remember trying to pretend to be a Sasquatch hunter when I was a little boy, walking around the neighborhood looking for Sasquatch tracks. And, you know, maybe it was my way of, I think it was my way of trying to cope with this experience that I had, instead of forcing it away and trying to ignore it. I think maybe I did try to do that, but my recurring nightmares would always kind of bring it up. At some point, I don't know really remember when it was, but at some point I just put it into my mind that I was just going to figure this out, you know, and I was going to face it. Maybe it was a conversation with my mom that I remember a brief conversation when I was younger that she said, if you're afraid of something, sometimes the best thing to do is to face it, and it will go away. So, in my own way, I did everything I could to face it, to read as much as I could, and I remember the day that I watched The Legend of Boggy Creek. That did not help anything at all. As a little boy, watching, especially after my experience, I was just like, it was just, oh man, I did not necessarily, it was fascinating to see that, of course, that film was very fascinating to me, but still, I remember being so scared after that for weeks. Anytime it would come on after that, I was like, no, I can't. I'm not going to watch The Legend of Boggy Creek again. But I did, I really did try to read everything I could back then, living in a small town, having a small library. There wasn't a whole lot of books available, but I did what I could, and when I got older, I branched out more and tried to read, get magazine subscriptions, and do as much research as I could.
John, considering the fact that you were only 7 when you had that encounter, when you're that young, it's awfully difficult to deal with stressful situations like that in your life. I know you really went through it, but it could have been a lot worse. It showed a lot of constitution to bounce back the way that you did. Now, moving forward, I want to talk about the Dogman encounter you had. But before you talk about that actual encounter and what you saw, lead us up to that encounter by telling us about why you were out there in the woods that day in the first place.
Sure. Well, at the time, I had just gone through a breakup with my girlfriend at the time. I was pretty sad. I was pretty broken up inside, and as I tend to do, especially if I'm going through something difficult in my life, especially emotionally, really the only place where I go to get solace for my ills is the forest. I love nature so much, and it's like my real home, I feel, in many ways. I live in a town most of the time, so I don't have direct access to be able to go out into the forest or into the woods. But when I'm able to, I do. When I was going through this difficult time, I went out to one of the state parks here that not too far away, and I went down one of the trails, and one of the habits that I tend to do is I'll go down the trail to a certain point, and when nobody else is around, I'll take a sharp turn and go off trail, and I'll go off trail quite a ways, not too terribly far where I could possibly get lost, but enough to be far enough away where I'm not going to be interrupted, or there's, someone who will walk by on the trail, that I'm truly alone and secluded. I really enjoy that feeling when I'm in the woods, and this case was no different. So it was probably about, I would say maybe about 100 yards off trail. Not too mountainous. I mean, it was hilly, of course, but the particular state park, off the top of my head, I wish I remembered the name of it, but went off trail at this park, and I went out to this area, and usually I just keep going until I feel like I've reached an area that's just untouched by man, that there isn't any logging or trees that have been cut down or anything like that. I like to be in an area where there isn't anything like that. This particular area that I got to this day, I was very familiar with the trails there, so I knew that there were no trails to the north of my location, because I had traveled north off the trail, and now the area, which is a beautiful, pristine Pacific Northwest forest view, if you can imagine. Beautiful ferns all over the ground, trees, foliage that come down from the Douglas fir trees that are all around, and there was a large tree that had come down at some point, and I had kind of set up a little, not a camp, but, I put down my backpack and my knife, and and everything, and kind of got myself situated because I wanted to start a video blog. That day was going to be my first video blog. I had just gotten a new smartphone and had a nice camera on it, and I wanted to experiment with starting videos. And I thought this would be a good time just to kind of share my heart and kind of share what I was going through at the moment. And as I started my video, and you're able to look at yourself on the phone while you're making a video, so you can see what you look like, kind of strange, but I remember going into the circumstances of where my heart was at during that time, and after about 5 minutes of talking, I had was kind of surprised by this, but I heard a baby cry to the northwest of my location where I was sitting on this log. I'm like, I didn't really just hear that, and I got up and I looked and didn't see any movement, didn't see anything unusual, and usually I'm very aware of my surroundings, and nothing seemed unusual to me. So I continued on with my video, because I really wasn't, my whole heart and soul was kind of coming out at this point, and I was sharing that on this video. And as I was talking, I heard the baby cry again. It was more distinct the second time. And I stopped. And at that point, my antenna kind of went up at that point, like, okay, what possibly could be going on here if there's anything unusual? And I got up, I stood up on the log, and I looked at the location of where the sound came from. And there was nothing out of place. There was nothing really, strange at all. I stood there for a good minute, just kind of observing and taking everything in, and, I didn't really sense anything anything that was wrong at that point. But it was very unusual to hear something like that out there, knowing that there was no other trails or there were no other people around. So kind of very reluctantly, I started going back to my to my video and started talking again, and then I heard a noise a little further to the north. The sounds I heard were coming from like the northwest, it seemed to be about 60 to 70 feet away, and I heard more direct to my north there was more of a hill, a little more pronounced hill. So I was kind of like down at the bottom of this hill, and I heard basically sounded like on the other side of this hill where it's kind of out of my view, I heard rustling of something kind of fairly large, an animal of some kind, of a movement, and that really kind of put me on edge at that point, since there were the three things happened that were kind of unusual. Sometimes, you do come across wildlife in the forest, and I'm not unaccustomed to that, but I know enough at this point, with all of the research that I've done, that that something could be afoot. So I got up and really tried, and I was using my camera too to pan and look to see, if I, as a Sasquatch researcher, if by chance hearing something like that, this would catch, when the Sasquatch beings come out from behind a tree or something, and you got your camera going, that's golden right there, So I wasn't necessarily expecting that, but I didn't know what could be going on. I kind of just assumed it could just be an animal, a deer or something. But I didn't see anything. I didn't see any movement. But after standing there and being quiet for at least about 30 seconds after that movement, I noticed that all the sounds of the forest had gone quiet. And you could hear a pin drop. At that point, before that, there were birds chirping, that typical, but I noticed that there was a silence that came upon the area, and the hair stood up on the back of my neck, and I knew at that point that something was happening. And that's a good indicator that I could be in trouble at that point. Because I'm fairly familiar with David Pilates' work, and people do go missing, especially up in the Pacific Northwest, and especially if you're alone, and especially if you go off trail. If these things are all, I am aware of those things, and I do it knowingly, but I walk, I seek to be as aware as I possibly can. I try to be prepared when I go out, but I'm not going to live my life in fear, because, if I was afraid I was going to go missing every time I go into the forest, I would never go into the forest. So I choose not to live that way. But having the forest go quiet like that, I've had it happen to me once before. Another an investigation I went on years prior, a Sasquatch investigation that I was on, the same thing happened to me then too, and I had an encounter then too. But it was a very eerie kind of calm that came over the area. So I was kind of on red alert at that point. But there was no movement. I didn't see anything. I had gotten my my fairly large combat knife out, and I'm just ready, as ready as I could be, with my camera going and everything. And as I was looking at the top of this hill where I heard this movement come, I focused in on this point where I had thought I had seen, this point that how to explain this? I guess I had noticed before. Either I had noticed before, or it had just appeared, and when my eyesight wasn't directly on that spot, and I had to take it. I remember after watching the video, I gasped, because what I was looking at, it looked just like a extremely large wolf was staring at me up on the top of the hill, and it was kind of this. It wasn't right out in the open, but it was like nestled in between the foliage, like the ferns and the bush, and I had to stop and say to myself, am I really seeing what I'm seeing? Is this a trunk of a tree, that a down tree, that can have odd shapes to it? I was staring at, and I don't have 20/20 eyesight anymore. I wish I did. I don't wear glasses when I drive. I had fairly decent vision, but I don't have perfect vision anymore. So at this distance, which was about 60 to 70 feet away, were what I was looking at, this space, for lack of better terms, it looked just like a large wolf head staring at me with its mouth slightly open and I could see not a whole lot of teeth, but I could see that the main canine teeth sticking out. And I remember saying to myself, and I have this on video, and I'm trying to focus in on my phone. And I'm like, I gotta get this, you know? And when you zoom in on one of these phones, the digital zoom, it kind of makes everything kind of distorted. So I don't think I really was able to get anything really well with the phone, but I was just, with my own vision, I was looking at it like, I'm not really seeing this, am I? And it's like, I got to the point where it hadn't moved at all for about a minute, and the thought crossed my mind, like, maybe I should go up the hill and to really check, because it's not moving at all. And then, as soon as I thought that, I saw movement of what looked like a tongue come out of its mouth, the stereotypical, like, licking the chops kind of, where the tongue would go across the outside of the upper part of the jaw. And at that point, I almost dropped my phone, and I was like, oh crap, I gotta get out of here. You know, my first thought, of course, you know, I'm a father. My first thought was that I gotta get back to my son. You know, at that point, I thought, if I really am looking at a Dogman, I'm in serious trouble. And I was kind of borderline whether or not I really, at that point, really knew, if they existed or not. I mean, people do see all kinds of interesting cryptids throughout the world, and I'm very aware of that. But I never thought that I might ever come across something like that. But at that moment, it was like a shiver went down my spine, and like, I have to get out. I have to, like, the fight or flight kind of response. And of course, it was the flight response. And I have my video going, and I'm talking and trying to communicate what's going on, and at that point, I'm talking to what it is I'm seeing. I'm like, okay, I'm leaving, you know, just chill out, don't come after me, you know, I'm talking like this to it, you know, trying to almost kind of make the situation lighthearted, you know, because I would not be surprised if it could feel my fear, if it was what I was really seeing. If I had a really strong fear response, that might not be something that would be a good thing for me. So I'm trying to make the very serious and scary situation more kind of like lighthearted, and I'm communicating with it, and I get down and I'm picking up my backpack, and you know, and I got my knife in my hand, and I'm walking backwards, trying to not trip over the foliage and so forth, and I'm keeping my eye and the camera on that area, because if it started moving, at least if I disappeared, maybe the camera would get it before it got me. And if there was a search found for me, you know, a search for me, they might be able to recover my phone or something, you know. Those things, all those little thoughts came zipping through my mind, you know, as I'm trying to get out. And I really wanted to just run. I wanted to run as fast as I could, but I knew that if I did that, if it really was a Dogman, if I really was seeing what I was seeing, that would be the worst response that I could probably do, especially being alone and off trail like that. And as soon as I was able to get down to a point where I was no longer in direct eyesight of that I couldn't see it. So that it couldn't see me, hopefully. I picked up my pace as much as I could without making the sound like I was running. You know, the last thing I wanted to do is to make it seem like I was fleeing, because it might have a pursuit response, you know. So I continued that way and really panning my whole area around me, both my own eyes and the camera, because I know at this point, with the knowledge that I have, that if there really is one, there very well and very possibly would be a second or more in the area. And I kept that in mind as I was trying to get out of the forest and trying to get back to the main trail. So ultimately, I got back. I was coming down the hill. I could see the trail in front of me, and thankfully there were a couple people who were coming down the trail at the same time as I was coming down this hill. And I was so relieved, and just to be with someone, to be around other people after that experience. And the thought did come into my mind, and I'm kind of almost ashamed to think of it, but I thought, like, well, if this thing really does come after me, at least I have someone else in front of me to kind of throw them in the way, you know, or something. Self-preservation kind of just kicks in at that point, you know. But, you know, I was really thankful to get out of that and, to get back on the trail and walk out and get into my car and breathe a huge sigh of relief, and I had to go back over the whole video of that experience, and I tell you, it was something I'll certainly never forget. And after that, that's when I really kind of like, okay, I need to know more about Dogman. I remember getting on Facebook and getting to be a part of your group, Vic, and then seeing and listening to Dogman encounters and hearing other people's first-hand encounters and reading some of the stories and hearing some of the interviews. It's like, oh man, my experience, if it was very mild compared to some of the others that have had first-hand encounters with these beings. But I felt something. One of the things that I'm a fairly empathic person. A lot of my friends would call me psychic, but I don't necessarily like to use that term, but I do have a sixth sense about me, and I've used that gift over the years. It saved my butt many times in the past, but I remember when I saw what I saw up on the hill, my sixth sense screamed to me, you've got to get out. It wasn't just a natural fight or flight response to something that you think you saw, but there was more to it. It's like there was a deeper warning that came. I don't know if it was necessarily a communication, a telepathic communication from it that was telling me to get out of its territory, that I was in its territory or what, but there was definitely something else there that told me that I had to leave and I needed to get out as soon as I could. And that could just be, my own gut reaction to the experience, but I really do feel that my intuition gave me a strong warning on top of that. So, which gives it, to me, a little more credence. Because I've seen things before but my intuition hasn't kicked off like that. And so I don't give some of those, when that doesn't happen for me, when my intuition doesn't kick in and really speak to me about a situation, it's usually pretty accurate. But in this situation, it really spoke to me very loud and clear. And I know, from my own research with Sasquatch, people have not just a normal fear response. It's like there's something deeper fear that comes. Almost, maybe some people would like to say it's a paranormal induced fear. And maybe that was part of that. I'm not 100% sure, but it was something that I'm not going to forget for quite a while. And especially now, when I go out into the woods, and I still do. I won't go back to that area where I was before, I'm not going to do that, but I can't, if it wanted me, I wouldn't be here right now. I'm convinced, if it wanted to get me, as pretty much almost any of the encounters that people have with these kind of beings, that they're so powerful and until I would imagine so very dangerous, that if they really put it in their mind that you're their next meal or whatever it might be, the reason behind their attack, that they really wanted to attack, you really wouldn't stand a chance. I mean, that's my opinion. I could be wrong, but I think that these beings are, if you see them and you walk away in some way, shape, or form with your life, and you don't end up disappearing, they let you go. That's my opinion.
Oh, I'd say you're right. There's no doubt about that. When you look at how well equipped they are to kill even larger animals, it would be a situation where they decided to let you go, if that is in fact what happened. I'm a little fuzzy on something with regards to your encounter there, John. Did you at any point ever see that Dogman's body, or only its head?
I just saw its head. I didn't see anything else besides the face that was looking directly at me.
Was its head in a position where it had to be in an upright position, standing on two legs watching you? Or could that have possibly been a huge timber wolf, even though you don't have any timber wolves out in that area?
Well, it looked like it was closer to the ground. It didn't look like, at least from the perspective where I was, it looked much closer to the ground. It didn't look like it was high above the ground. Like if it was a Dogman or a timber wolf, it was on all fours probably. Almost the kind of impression I got that it was sneaking up. Sneaking up to see me, and that kind of was the impression I got. So when I saw it, I had to double take, like I was looking at scanning that whole particular area, because that's where I heard the rustling of the sound at first, and at one point I didn't see that, and then at another point I did see it. So I don't know. It's like it snuck up, or peeked its head out maybe when I just wasn't looking at that direct spot. I don't know.
Understand too, John, that dogmen can look just like a massive timber wolf when they go down on all fours. So, considering the fact that there aren't any timber wolves in that area, you just might have been looking at a dogman, especially when you consider the size of its head that you were talking about seeing. As part of the after effects of that encounter, you had an interesting thing happen with the video that you recorded of that incident. Could you share the particulars of that with us?
Well, after I had that experience, I got into my car and I watched that whole video several times. I did upload it to my YouTube channel, and I had a few friends watch it, and they couldn't see anything. When I zoomed in with the camera, they all got distorted. But what was all very clear was my own reactions to it. And one of my friends, after watching the video, he was like, "Man, that kind of reminded me of the Blair Witch Project." He was just like, "What?" The kind of reaction that I had to it, and the kind of feel that the video had was like that. And I had it on my channel for probably, I didn't have it on public, I had it unlisted because it was a private video, and it wasn't something that I was experimenting with doing a video blog, and so it was kind of personal, and it was just something that I just wasn't going to try to promote, especially since I couldn't really make out what it was that I was seeing on the video. But after I started doing research and so forth on the Dogman and getting part of your group and so forth, and remember there was a post that had come up on your group, and I remember commenting, it's like, I had an experience of a Dogman, and I even have a video about it. And they were like, oh, a couple of people on the post were like, oh, let's share it, please, So I'm like, oh, sure. So I go to my channel, and it's not there. And I'm like, what? I have a couple channels. So I went, I put on the wrong channel, so I went and checked out all my channels, and it wasn't there. And I'm like, that's crazy. Why wouldn't it be there? So I go, I'm going to upload it again, Maybe YouTube took it down for some reason. I don't know. But I didn't get any indications, that there was anything wrong with it. So I go onto my phone to upload it again, and it's gone. My first thought was like, well, the government hacked my phone and took it, took my picture, my video of the Dogman, but, I don't know what happened to it. It sounds crazy. It sounds like a tinfoil hat moment, But I tell you, I don't have an explanation for why I don't have it anymore. And I know the stereotypical response. I've been in the Sasquatch research community for a long time, and I know that the typical response to something like that is if that happened to somebody else, oh, I got it on video, but oh, the government took it, or, somebody comes out with that kind of a response, like, oh, right, yeah, you really did, huh? So I'm kind of like cynical about it at this point, where I know that I did it, I know it happened to me, I don't have an explanation for why I don't have it anymore. And I wish I did have it. I know that the capability of being able to go on a device like a smartphone and remove something like that, I know it's possible. I know it can be done. You just wouldn't ever think that it would be that video. Why would they go through the trouble? Didn't really even show anything. But still, it disappeared. And I don't really have a rational explanation for it.
That is awfully strange. It sure sounds like you met with some kind of foul play, but like you said, we never will know what really happened to that video. It's a shame, because it sounds like it would have been awfully interesting to watch. Well, John, it's time to wrap the show up. Do you have any closing comments you'd like to share?
I do want to say thank you, Vic, for the kind of work that you do. To put yourself out like you are, to have a podcast, a website, and to do interviews like this, you're really putting yourself out there, and you're really doing great work, in my opinion. And I've seen a lot of people, especially in the Sasquatch community, do that. They put themselves out there, and they really want to be a voice in the community and so forth. And I've had friends who have been attacked, and it's not pleasant. It's a lot of times, and you put, especially something like Bigfoot or Dogman. Dogman. I mean, that's a crazy subject, and open to a huge amount of ridicule and things like that. I just want to tip my hat to you, Vic, because for me, if you weren't doing what you were doing, there would be a lot of people who wouldn't be able to tell their story. And I think this is important. I think it's a huge mystery that needs to be looked at and examined. I think you're doing a great job of doing it from all the stuff that you've been putting out.
Well, thank you for the good words there, John. I really do appreciate it. Don't feel too bad for me when you love what you do the way that I love doing this. It doesn't really matter if you have naysayers that don't agree with what you say or do. It's really no big deal or consequence to me. But I really want to thank you again for coming on the show. I really do appreciate your time.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks again. Well, as you know, don't be a stranger, okay?
Okay, you got it.
I appreciate it. Well, have a great night.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. If you've had a Dogman encounter and you want to speak with me, whether in private or on the show, you can reach me at contact@dogmanencounters.com. I'd love to hear from you.